In this tutorial, I'll show you how to use the brushes in the Fluid Paint Landscape brush pack I created for Corel Painter. These brushes are compatible with Painter 2023 and later. These are all particle brushes, so you're going to be able to get a lot of different looks out of these brushes depending on the gestures you use, the colors you use, and other properties. The first brush we'll look at is called Active Clouds. Let's choose white for our color. And what's special about the Fluid Paint brush packs is that they use the Fluid Paint technology. This means that you can fluidly go from heavy to light pressure and go from heavy to light opacity. So for clouds like this, I can get the shadow areas of the clouds with light pressure, and I can get the highlights with heavy pressure, and then just fade it together. If I use more spontaneous gestures, then I can really easily create clouds without a whole lot of effort. And it feels very natural, like I'm blending paint. This is why these brushes are called fluid. Many of these brushes can utilize the flow map, so if I change the flow map to something different like horizontal flow, then I can get a different pattern in my flow map. I'll change it to fine dots, and now you can see there's a bit of a dotted pattern. So maybe if you wanted something that looks more like it's going into the grain of the canvas, you could play with the scale of that, and you could get sort of a canvas effect. You can also change the size of your brush to get different results. But for a lot of brushes, changing the brush size too large or too small might ruin the appearance of the brush. In this case, what would be better is to reset the brush, paint the cloud that I want, and then free transform it to make it bigger. One thing to note about fluid paint brushes is that they work best on a layer, meaning you don't want to use them on the canvas layer. The next brush is called Broken Details, but we'll skip ahead a bit to Misty Grass because we'll use that in conjunction with Broken Details. For Misty Grass, we'll select a grass color, and I'll choose the shadow color first because I'll put highlights on top of that. I'm going to use lighter pressure in the background and increase my pressure as I move into the foreground. The grass will get bigger and darker, and I'll get that nice sense of perspective. Now I can select a highlight color that's brighter, and this time I'll just add a few highlights using really quick light strokes in the background, and then increase my pressure as I move into the foreground. That gives me a really nice grass effect. And as you can see, there's a sense of distance because things that move into the distance often get foggier and lighter like this. Just as well, if I back up a bit, I can utilize that lighter pressure here in the foreground if I just wanted to lightly build up those highlights rather than have them be too strong. You'll also notice that in addition to opacity, brush size is linked to pressure, so when I press harder, my brush size gets wider. Many of these other brushes can do that as well, but opacity linked to pressure is what they all have in common. Now that I have some grass here, I'm going to create a new layer that is a thick paint layer. Only a couple of these brushes are able to utilize thick paint by default, but really just about any brush in Painter can utilize thick paint as long as you enable impasto. By painting on a thick paint layer, you'll have more control over that thickness. So I'll select Broken Details, which is one of the brushes that can utilize thick paint. I'm going to change my paper grain to something that's a little more broken up like simulated wood grain, and I'll make sure that the scale and contrast are turned all the way up. This brush utilizes the flow map, so I'm going to make sure to have the clouds flow map selected. And then I'm going to paint some flowers here, so I'll choose kind of a bright magenta color like this. And I'll just paint a few horizontal strokes across the canvas and use light pressure as I move into the distance. Now you can see these flowers fade into the distance just like the grass does. I'll select another color that's a bit different and just go over that again. Then select a white color and do it again. And now those flowers have some highlights or maybe some different colors on them. And I can go in here and I can add some visible depth to make the paint thicker. And this is a very subtle effect, but it looks like little globs of paint. That gives the flowers some dimension. Let's skip ahead a bit and we'll go to Dirt Path, and let's put a dirt path in this grass. I'm going to select a brown color like this. I'll create a new default layer, and I'll use lighter pressure in the background and heavier pressure as I move into the foreground. And I'll select a darker brown, and I'll just do a few strokes over that with lighter pressure going into the background. I could even put in some highlights as well. But as you can see, I have a lot of control over the paint and I can fade it in really nicely. I'll delete some of these layers just to clean this up a bit. Let's go back to Cloudy Flow. I'll select white for that. Cloudy flow can create all kinds of different shapes depending on the gesture that you use. You can do very tight circles like this to create clumpy clouds, or you can pull out wispy strokes like this, and you can get everything in between simply by making gestures. You can let this build up to create highlights on your clouds. You can use lighter pressure to create very faint distant clouds or to create shadows in clouds, and then you can gradually fade them together. The next brush we'll look at is the earth brush. This works really well for painting stone, mountains, and other types of earth. I'm going to select a really dark blue, and the pen that I'm using is the Wacom Art Pen because it can sense barrel rotation, so I can rotate this flat dab and easily change the shape of the brush. The Wacom Art Pen is the only pen that supports rotation, so if you're using something else, you may want to change it from rotation to bearing, and then you'll be able to tilt your pen to change the shape of the dab. I'm going to use the edge of the brush in a vertical position to draw in a nice mountain shape like this. Then I can turn my brush kind of going in the same direction of the edge that I'm trying to flatten out, and I can sharpen it up a bit if I don't like that broken edge. And then what I want to do is I want to start to use lighter pressure here so that I can begin to fade this out. That'll create mist at the bottom, which helps it look more distant, like a mountain should, but it will also create texture and form. Even lighter pressure down here at the bottom. Now you can go back over this again with medium pressure and just kind of blend the dark into the light. That way you get a nice even transition. Doesn't have to be perfectly smooth, it's nice to have a little bit of character. Now that we have something like that, we can turn on Preserve Transparency, and we can select lighter colors, and again, make my brush a bit smaller. And I'm going to use the edge of the brush with pressure that goes from heavy to light, just to pull out little shapes like this, and make my mountain look like it's divided with peaks that have shadows and highlights. Then I'll sample one of these shadow colors, and I'll put in some shadows on the opposite side. Could even make my color a bit brighter, and add a few very, very light strokes here, and I can really easily create mountains. This brush doesn't have any impasto because I don't like the way it looks, but if you wanted to, you could add impasto, and then that would thicken up the paint a bit. But I'd rather use thick paint brushes for this. If there's any impasto on your canvas that you want to get rid of, you can click on Clear Impasto to get rid of it. I'll turn off Preserve Transparency and clear this layer out. Let's take a look at Hazy Trees. We'll select a bluish color like this. As you might imagine, this creates trees that look very distant and hazy. So I'm going to do one plane of trees here. So I'll have it be kind of light at the top, but even lighter at the bottom and have it fade out. Then I'll use heavier pressure in front of that, making sure to leave a little bit of that light area in between, and that'll create darker trees that are in the foreground on another plane. I can fade those out at the bottom. And if I need to, I can go back in and just darken these up a bit at the top, just to balance it out a bit. I could darken my color just a bit and go in front of that and create another plane of trees. When I'm doing this out of context of the rest of the painting, it might not make a whole lot of sense, but you can check out my demonstration landscape painting to see how this would fit in. But as you can imagine, this effect would make the trees look more distant as well. I could then turn on Preserve Transparency, select other colors, and I could add highlights as well if I wanted to brighten those up and add dimension to them. Let's turn off Preserve Transparency and clear that out. Next is Hedges. I'll select a dark green. Same basic principle, you want to put in your dark color first. If you want distant hedges, you can use light pressure. So this one could be in front of the other one. And then I can select lighter colors. I could lighten this one in the distance a bit using very light pressure. Lighten the one in the foreground a bit as well using light pressure again. And that'll give me this nice fractal pattern, which is based on your flow map. So you could get different patterns here if you want something that's a little more leafy. This one's over in shadow, so I'll use a darker color. Let's try the next brush, which is Limbs. I'm going to select a lighter color here. And I'll just demonstrate how this brush works by creating a tree trunk. Heavier pressure, of course, gives me a more opaque trunk, which is thicker at the bottom and gets thinner at the top if I use lighter pressure. So I can really easily create tree trunks and branches, or if I were creating something that's a bit closer, these could be branches on a tree that's more close up. If you wanted the branches to look like they're going off into the distance, or maybe just getting less distinct, you could use lighter pressure. Or you could have different layers of branches. So maybe these are in some mist farther away. So you get that nice texture on the branches. And if you wanted to, you could select another color and you could easily add highlights. Let's try Rising Smoke next. I'll select the Clouds Flow map in a medium gray color. I'll pull down from the top using heavy pressure at the top, and you'll notice if I overlap the strokes, they start to build up lighter. That's because this brush is using paint layering. If I disable that, then the strokes will just build up like this, and if I use lighter pressure, then I get smoke that is thinner. There are different ways to use paint layering. I could make this smoke build up darker by setting it to multiply. Now I get thick black smoke. So because there's a lot of different types of smoke, you have many options to choose from here. Next, we'll take a look at Sandy. This brush gives you a really nice sandy texture, but you can also use it for stars and snow and maybe even rain. I'll start with a dark brown color, and I'm just going to build up some sand. This brush is utilizing grain, so if you don't like that fractal pattern where the sand builds up more in the fractal shapes, you can set that to something like basic paper that doesn't have as much texture, and then the sand will build up more evenly. We'll select a lighter brown and go over that, and then select white and go over that. As you can see, I get this really nice sand effect. But I also have control over the opacity, so I can use very, very light pressure like this, and then gradually fade to heavier pressure, so I have a lot more control over the opacity of these speckles. So if I wanted to add a little bit of speckles to something and slowly build it up, I can do that very easily. Or if I want something like snow, I can just pull down something like this. I could have some fainter snow down here on the bottom, and bigger, thicker, heavier snow up here at the top. Let's take a look at Seafoam. This is another brush that can utilize thick paint, so I'll create a thick paint layer to paint on, and I'll add some visible depth. Let's say there's a big wave here on the beach, and in between are some little seafoam things, and I'm just doing little squiggly strokes like this. In the background, I want to use lighter pressure so that those foamy things are thinner and they're a little bit more blended with the background color. And then as I move into the foreground, I'll use firmer pressure to make them a lot brighter and bigger. Again, outside of the context of the rest of the painting, it might look a little odd, but basically you get these really thick seafoam effects that are nice. You can control the shadow by changing the visible depth. If you don't want there to be any shadow, you don't have to have any at all, but it's nice to have a little bit there so it looks thick. The next brush is Sharp Trees. This brush utilizes color variability, as do a couple of other brushes. So to give you an example of what that means, I'll just paint a few strokes next to each other here, and you'll see that some of them might be slightly different in color because I have a bit of hue saturation and value variability. So like with the other tree brushes, it's good to start with a dark color. And again, I could have trees that are further back like this in the distance. This is utilizing the flow map, so if I change the flow map to something else, I'll get a different pattern. You can see that looks more like leaves. And then I can gradually lighten my color using lighter pressure to add highlights, which gives form to the tree. Even lighter pressure in the background here, so these look more distant. And I have some pretty nice looking trees. Let's take a look at how we can paint another type of trees. If you've ever been to the Pacific Northwest, you'll know that there are these big rolling hills that have a lot of pine trees. So if I use heavier pressure, I can create more opaque trees, and then I can fade it out like this. And I can do another hill in front of that with heavier pressure to get bigger trees that are more opaque, and I can kind of fade those out. Make my color a bit darker and go in front of that. And I can quickly paint in millions of trees. And then I can get really creative with it and go in here and create a few little islands of trees that stick up a bit, or enhance what's already there to create layers. This is a fantastic brush. And if I wanted to, I can put highlights on top of that, but I would recommend creating a separate layer for that. That way you'll have more control over how you blend it in. And you can easily work back and forth between colors to create the kind of forest you like. The final brush in this pack is Water Flow. I'll select a white color. And in the background, I'm going to use very, very light pressure That's going to blend with the blue of the background. And then as I move into the foreground, I'm going to use heavier pressure, and that's going to create a highlight. Now let's say maybe this is a reflection on the ocean from the sun, and the sun is maybe up here like this. I get that really nice fade in one stroke. So again, these are brushes that you have to feel. You actually have to try them out and see all this detail and this variation in value or color that you can get in one stroke without having to use other brushes to get this effect. If you want to get your hands on these brushes, you can find them on my website at aaronrutten.com.